At 9:25 p.m. last night, widow Mrs. Daisy Smith was found dead in her apartment. The cause of death was ruled to be poisoning. Who did it? Well, chum, that's what we're here to find out. Sit down. I'm Gertrude Gumshoe, the detective leading this case. Don't like me, huh? The victim, Mrs. Smith, seems to have died drinking from a poisoned bottle of wine she had received as a gift that evening. As the widow of a wealthy businessman, she was constantly receiving presents from people sending in their condolences, so presumably she didn't think much of it. As for who sent her that wine, well, there's no evidence at the crime scene. However, there are a few people of interest it might be worth hearing from. We have several suspects lined up who all would have good reasons to want Mrs. Smith gone. The first suspect is well-known businessman Conway MacDonald. Mr. McDonald and the victim's late husband ran a successful company together, and when Mr. Smith died, his part of the business was taken over by Mrs. Smith. Well, rumor has it that Mr. McDonald wasn't happy with Mrs. Smith's involvement in the company. He found her to be meddling and annoying with a lack of business knowledge, which was leading their company to spiral into debt. So, to get her out of the way, what if he sent Mrs. Smith the poisoned bottle of wine? But Mr. McDonald denies these claims. He states that there's really no reason for him to want Mrs. Smith dead. As a matter of fact, she was only attached to the business in name only, and actually had no involvement in it at all. He'd be surprised if she'd even known the name of the company. Besides, a failing business would be no problem for him. He says there's a reason he's known as such a successful businessman. That leads us to our next suspect, Mrs. Smith's maid, Mary. Mary was working at the victim's apartment last night, and she was the last person to see her alive. Mrs. Smith was said to be incredibly rude to her staff, often disrespecting and underpaying them. What if Mary, sick of being treated like dirt, wanted revenge and poisoned Mrs. Smith's drink? She would have had the perfect opportunity to do so while serving her boss the gifted wine. But Mary laments that she would never do such a thing. Why, sure, Mrs. Smith could be a little rude at times, but Mary had been her maid for many years now and knew not to take it personally. Besides, there's nothing she would have possibly gained from murdering her employer. In fact, she would have been out of a much-needed job. Another highly suspicious person is the victim's sister-in-law, Countess von Blutvergiftung. Not only a close family friend, she is also the next heir in line to the vast Smith fortune. Allegedly, when Mr. Smith died, the family expected his sister, the Countess, to inherit most of his estate. However, she was surprised and horrified to learn that she had been left out of the will entirely, with everything going to his widow, Mrs. Smith. It's possible that, in order to inherit both her brother and sister-in-law's money, she sent Mrs. Smith the poisoned bottle of wine. But the Countess says that's far from the truth. Yes, she was left out of her brother's will, but Mrs. Smith was a very dear friend of hers, and she never wished her any harm. Besides, she didn't need any money from her late brother. Just look at her jewels and furs. She's a countess after all. Our last suspect is Mrs. Smith herself. Yes, really. What if? Unhappy with her life, Mrs. Smith faked her death, replacing her body with a look-alike while her maid was busy calling the police. Then she fled the scene to start a new life and assume a new identity. But all of that doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not that easy to simply start a new life with a new identity. Besides, if she were using a look-alike body, well, that's a completely new murder victim to consider. No. The more likely theory is suicide. But that raises a whole lot of other questions. Why would she act like somebody poisoned her? Was she trying to frame somebody? Gee, this case is a lot tougher than I thought. I'm going to need your help. What do you say? Who do you think poisoned Mrs. Smith?